Good evening, USA. Good morning, Asia. Good night, Europe. I'm Chris Tang, the Faculty Director of the UCLA Center for Global Management. Welcome to the Wilbur Wu Greater China Business Series organized by the UCLA Center for Global Management. This event is also sponsored by the UCLA Forecast, as well as the UCLA Asia Pacific Center. Before I begin, let me say a few words about Wilbur Wu. Wilbur Wu was born in 1916 in a village near Guangzhou in China. Then, in 1942, he received his bachelor degree from UCLA. Since then, he has become a major figure in the Los Angeles business, political, cultural, and charitable arenas. And he was a vice chairman of the Cathay Bank. As a way to express their gratitude to the training Wilbur has received from UCLA, he and his wife, Beth, endowed the Wilbur Wu Greater China Business Speaker Series 20 years ago. Today, the Wu family's goal for this speaker series was, and still is, to facilitate dialogue, promote understanding, and strengthen the important ties between the Greater China region and the United States. So we're grateful to the Wu family for the continued support. Over the next hour, we're going to discuss the contrasting trajectories of two significant economies, the slowing economy of China and the rising economy of India. China has boasted explosive growth since the economic reform in 1978 and its ascension to WTO in 2001. Everything was going strong until COVID. Instead of having the double-digit growth, the current projections for 2024 hovering around 5%. Over the Himalayas, India's growth has traditionally been slower than China, but things are changing rapidly in India. And the projected growth in 2024 is around 7%. To understand the scale of these two countries that dominates the world economies for many centuries, I had the privilege to discuss this with two experts this evening, Professor Roman Wasiak and Dr. William Yu. First, it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Roman Wasiak. He holds the Hans Husschmidt Chair in Management at the UCLA Anderson School. Besides teaching global economics, he is our beloved instructor for a global immersion program in India. Next, it gives me joy to introduce Dr. William Yu. He is an economist of our UCLA Forecast. He focuses on the global economic trends, especially in the Greater China region. Roman and William, welcome. I know both of you have prepared wonderful slides to share with us to set the stage about the current economic situations in China and India. So let me begin with William, followed by Roman. William, over to you.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. It's my honor to be here. Okay, so let me begin with the introduction to the Chinese economy and its outlook. So I would like to discuss China's GDP first. So over the past year, despite this widespread negative news on the Chinese economy, the Chinese government reported that their 2023 GDP growth was 5.2%. Is that accurate? Some people say the number is too high. Some people say it should be 4.5%, it should be 4%, it should be 3.5%. So it's good. Anderson Forecast, we had our own model to estimate Chinese economic growth. So our alternative model is very simple. We use four easily available inputs: energy consumption, CO2 emission, total trade, home price. So in this chart, you can see the blue line represents the Chinese government official number. The red line represents our model estimation. So you can see our model's estimation about Chinese economic growth is lower and more volatile. So in 2023, our model estimates China's GDP growth was only 0.8%. So it's up to you to kind of think about whether which number is more accurate. So right now, I argue that the Chinese economy is facing three major structural problems, and this will cause difficulty for China, and it will take a long time, I believe, to fix. Number one, real estate bubble bust. I will discuss more later. Number two, great powers competition. So because of US-China strategic competition, we are seeing more and more de-risking policy implemented by both the United States and China. And I will show you how this has impacted the international trade. Number three, state advance and private sector retreat. We know this will have negative impact on business and investor confidence, rule of law, and property rights in China. So let's talk about real estate market. So here in this chart, I show you the residential real estate investment as a percentage of GDP. The blue line is the United States over the past century. The red line is China, given the available data. So although the number is relatively small compared to GDP, but we find out this number actually is a very good correlation with the business cycle in the United States. For example, we find out, you look at the blue line, this residential share as GDP usually fluctuate around 3% to 6%, averaging around 4.5%, as you can see marked in this dashed line here. So we found out when the residential investment share is above this average line for too high for too long, it signals overinvestment. And then it will follow housing downturn and potentially a recession. So for example, in 2005, US economy experienced a real estate bubble at a peak, around 6.6% of its GDP, and then it crashed to 2.4% in 2011. And that triggered a very painful housing slump and Great Recession. So right now, let's look at China. China's residential investment has surpassed 6.6% the peak in the United States since 2006, and then reached above 9%, 10% persistently over the past decade. So let's signal China's real estate bubble is much bigger than the United States. And we have other data to support that. So in the past 3 years, we see this high investment decline from 10.3% to 6.7%. So that kind of a decline similar to Great Recession we have. So actually is another evidence of the real estate bubble bust in China. But the problem is 6.7%, the current level is still very high. So we expect there will be a continuation of the contraction in this real estate sector. Finally, I want to say, history, like Great Depression in the 30s, Great Recession we just talked about, or Japan's lost decades, tell us that in the aftermath of this real estate bubble bust, we will see a long-term stagnation when the household, company, and banks are afraid to consume, invest, borrow money, lending money, because they need to repair their balance sheet. And that is, I expect, what China is going to deal with. Okay, so let's look beyond just residential real estate investment. So let's include all kinds of investment, like commercial real estate, public infrastructure, and manufacturing. So in this chart, I show you the investment share as GDP of a country. The blue line represents United States. The black line represents the world average, fluctuate around 25%. The green line is Japan, and the red line is China. So as we can see, China's investment share of its GDP has surpassed 40% since 2008 and stay there. So we have never seen something like this in a major economy. Yeah, so that represents another huge, massive investment. And usually this overinvestment means misallocation of resources, negative return, and a lot of defaults at the end. And then eventually, when the bubble bursts, just like Japan's have in the 1990s, you are going to see the investment share of GDP will decline. So is GDP growth, and that is what we expect China will go through. I know a lot of people, especially Wall Street, are hoping to see Chinese government implement a large-scale fiscal stimulus and easy money policy to reignite China's growth engine. But this is exactly what Chinese government has been doing repeatedly over the past decade. And that's why we have seen this kind of very high investment share in the past decade. So I don't think China is going to have a lot of room to do this again. So here I show you another indicator. Usually overinvestment comes with over leverage and debt. All right. So in this chart, I show you the private sector debt to the GDP ratio of a country. So blue line is United States, the green line is Japan, and the red line is China. So we can see that China's debt ratio increased rapidly over the past decade and reached 230% of the GDP, very high level. And if we include the government debt, China's total debt ratio to GDP is 307%, much higher than United States, 253%, higher than G20's average, 248%. Yeah. So basically, my conclusion is China will face a prolonged and painful deleveraging process in the future. So finally, I would like to show you how this supply chain adjustment going on with this de-risking policy implemented by the United States, try to pursue this so-called supply chain resilience. So in this chart, I show you the U.S. top 10 goods import source region and its import share. So the blue bar represents the import share in 2016, 2 years before the U.S.-China trade war occurred in 2018. And the yellow bar is 2019. The red bar is the latest 2023. So the biggest change is China. China used to be our number one import share, import source country, account for 21% of our total imports, and right now declined by 7.3 percentage point, down to 14%. And right now, Mexico is our largest import share country, increased by 2 percentage points. So this is what we call nearshoring. And on the right-hand side of the chart, you can see our U.S. imports from South Korea, from Vietnam, from Taiwan, India, Ireland has all increased. So, so what we are talking about, friendshoring, and this is the evidence for that. So I believe we're going to talk about more in terms of supply chain and international trade later. So I'm going to turn it to Roman.
Thank you, William. And thank you to Chris and to CGM and to the Forecast for this kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be talking about these two countries that I both greatly admire, who have both ancestral cultures and histories, and that I'm very glad for both of them to see them having emerged as major powers on the world scene. So the points I prepared are perhaps of a longer term nature, trying to talk about the rise of India in a historical perspective. And I just want to make three basic points. First, talk a little bit about the mixed macroeconomic record that India has had over the last 50 years or so. Talk about some of the challenges and opportunities of the Indian economy. And then finally conclude by asking the question of whether the rise of India helps counter China's influence, which is the topic of our overall discussion, to help launch the Q&A that follows. So that will be pretty brief because I suspect it will be the subject of most of the questions. If you look at a comparative perspective at the growth of India's and China's economy over the last 45 years or so, you see that at least by the official numbers, these are World Bank numbers, China has outperformed India greatly, and I think this is confirmed when you travel to both countries. When you look at tangible signs of material wealth, China is much richer than India now. But this has not been the case systematically throughout this period. And you have, particularly in recent years, so roughly since the 2010s, had several years where India has outperformed China's economy, and it's certainly the case right now. So the World Bank forecast for India's growth as of last year, because it's still a forecast, we don't have the full numbers in yet, is about 6.3% for India and 5% for China. And this gap between the two is expected to be bigger even in 2024. So as Chris said, the expected growth of India is going to be about 7%. So if you look at this sort of as a stock rather than the annual change in GDP, the implication of China's higher growth has been that it is much richer than India now. And in fact, if you look at a measure of per capita income adjusted for the purchasing power differences, so using exchange rates that compensate for purchasing power, China's GDP per capita is about $22,000 per year, while India is about $8,000 per year. So China is really on the now toward the upper end of the middle upper income country, according to the World Bank, while India is right making its way into that category. Just for reference, U.S. per capita GDP is still about 4 times as high as China. So it's $80,000 per year per person in the U.S. now, using the same numbers as I have here. So that puts things a little bit in perspective. Both countries are still a long way from the technological frontier in terms of wealth, but of course catching up very rapidly. If you look at other indicators, they're also interesting. So if you look at the openness to trade of India and China, they've both risen a lot up to the point of the Great Recession, and then they stabilized, even fell after that as a result of multiple shocks. First, of course, the 2008 Great Recession, and then the COVID crisis, and of course the deglobalization that accompanied all of this period of the last 15 years or so. And you see a stabilization. But what's striking is how similar their trade to GDP ratios are. Of course, since India's GDP is only 4 trillion, in terms of the actual amount of exports that they do, or trade that they perform, it's much less than China's, which has a GDP that's about almost 5 times bigger. But nonetheless, they are equally, they have an equal propensity to trade internationally. I'm glossing over a lot of detail. So in particular, when it comes to China, the big story is exports. When it comes to India, which is more of a country that has a trade deficit, a lot of this is also driven by imports. But it gives you a sense of how engaged they are with the world economy, which is completely new for both countries. If you think about a period of 100 years, the Chinese emergence on the world scene was a phenomenon that started in the 80s and, of course, accelerated in the decades that followed. While for India, it started, at least a decade later in the 90s or even in the mid 90s with the balance of payments crisis that they experienced. But nonetheless, they're both kind of in the same place now. Another feature of the Indian economy is that it's an inflationary country. They have done a great job at moderating these inflationary pressures in recent years. So as you can see, they had really, really high inflation, over 10% in many years, and that's now stabilized somewhat around 5%, a little less in the very recent years, and it's expected to improve. That's largely a result of improved macroeconomic management, and we can talk more about that. Because in India's inflationary, its currency has been steadily devaluing, and that puts India in stark contrast with China, where the big story of the last 50 years or so, or 40 years, let's say, since the liberalization has been one of appreciating currency. In the case of India, that's not the case, and it's a direct consequence of the fact that India is a deficit country as opposed to a surplus country like China. Now, if you look at the very recent period, so last year was actually a year in which the rupee did not devalue and remained stable. And we can address this in the future, but my view, and I think it's buttressed by a lot of scholarship, is that when a country starts its phase of intensive growth and starts to really go into, become a larger share of the world economy, it tends to have an appreciating currency. And this is indeed what, over the very long run, you should see happen for India. Of course, you should never trust economists that try to predict exchange rates, especially in the short run. But over the very long run, I think that's a regularity to which we can come back. I think I mentioned that India was persistently a deficit country. The effect of very high intensive growth could also be a reversal of the fact that it's a deficit country. This will depend a lot on the development of the financial sector and the ability of India to channel savings into its economy. The more it can do that, the more you should expect this deficit to reverse itself. I only have one slide for this. Perhaps people can ask me about the opportunities and challenges that India faces in greater detail during the Q&A. The opportunities are that, first, it's a huge market. In terms of just the sheer size, it's the largest country in the world by population. It also has a dynamic demographic path. So I don't know if I can click on this demographics, if someone can get us to that slide and then come back when I'm done. But this shows the comparative path of population in China and India. Just last year, India overtook China as the largest country in the world in terms of population. And the projections are quite stark. India's fertility rate is now 2.1, which is just at the level of replacement, while China has fallen well below 1. And so China last year, experienced a decline in its population, while India continues to experience an increase. It's expected that the fertility rate in India will fall below the replacement level, but because demographics are very, have a lot of inertia, its population is expected to grow until 2060. And the result of that, of course, is a very youthful population, with the median age somewhere around 25 years old in India. And that feeds into the growth potential of the country. So I think we can go back now. Thank you. It also has a growing middle class, which means larger markets for many countries. We can click on that if you'd like to see it. India's middle class is expected to be about 1 billion people by 2030. And the definition of the middle class is somewhat arbitrary, but there's no doubt that people with the means to consume more, they're going to be more numerous in India, and you can see here in comparison with China and the rest of the world. I've listed some other advantages. Of course, it's hard to list them all in a single slide. But India's comparative advantage in digital technologies is another one. It has made huge strides, in particular, in transforming the monetary payments side of its economy towards digital payments. The fact that it's a parliamentary democracy, in my view, is a long-term strength of India. It creates more checks and balances than exist in countries like China. And while it can also slow things down in the short run, prevent reforms and make things a little more ponderous, over the long run, I think it's a factor of great stability. And I'm sure you'll have questions on the future of Indian democracy, because it's coming a little bit under stress with the rise of nationalist populism. But overall, I think that most of the institutions of parliamentary democracy are holding in India. Certainly to a much greater degree than in China. I think the pluralistic culture, the fact that there's such a diverse set of interest groups in India is also a strength. I've written some other advantages there. One is that once a country starts on the path of intensive growth, which is what China experienced in the 90s and 2000s, it has all sorts of accelerator effects in terms of attracting foreign investment, in terms of becoming a destination for talent, et cetera. That is a self-feeding process, and I think these opportunities create the growth, but then they feed. It's a self-feeding process as well. And India's business landscape is also quite remarkable. It has major firms that are flagship conglomerates that are now multinationals, and their household names all around the world. And India, of course, is more welcoming also to foreign multinationals operating there. I think it's fair to say, if you look at the tech landscape, for example, that all the major tech companies in the US, Amazon, Apple, Google, Facebook, et cetera, are very heavily present in India. Of course, there are huge challenges as well, and I've listed those on the right side of the slide. The three that we focus on the most in my class when we go to India, and I've done so a number of times now at UCLA Anderson, visiting the country, are the triple bottlenecks of insufficient infrastructure, lack of access to capital, and also lack of access to human capital, so the challenge of skilling. But there are others as well, and one that I think is often underplayed are the governance issues that exist in India. It's extremely hard to do business in India. India, compared to China, ranks routinely lower on doing business indices around the world. It has a very slow judiciary. It has a very high level of corruption. Policy is often unpredictable, although this has improved under the Modi government, and I think there's much more predictability for businesses, at least. And then it's an incredibly complex system as well. I suppose every human society is complex, but adopting a comparative lens, India breaks a lot of records. The status of women, India has one of the lowest shares, labor force participation rate for women. It has a lower labor force participation rate than Saudi Arabia does, and it has not increased in recent years, which is very troubling, and also an anomaly. When you think of a growing country, typically women's status improves and their participation in labor markets improved. This means that there's a huge untapped pool of talent and productivity that is not being used efficiently in India, and it's something that policymakers should worry about. Other low socioeconomic status groups as well, because India has a caste system. This creates a challenge for the allocation of talent to the more efficient uses. And then finally, India has always been ambiguous about globalization, and that's the case for the Modi government as well. And I think that it's fair to say that whenever India has experienced some outward-oriented reforms, it has grown fast, and whenever it has been hesitant to do that, it has slowed down. And it's something that you really see clearly in the growth record of India, and it is a challenge that they face, becoming more comfortable with the world economy. So will the rise of India help counter China? My answer would be a yes, but. There's, of course, two big initiatives right now that people talk about that are designed to counter the influence of China and place India at the center of them. The first is the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, which is a Biden administration initiative with about 13 countries, including India, to try to create closer economic links, excluding China. So it's sort of a substitute for the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which was an initiative of the Obama administration that ended up failing. And then on the realm of geopolitics, there's the Quad, the attempt to create a more military or strategic alliance between the US, India, Japan, and Australia in the broader Indo-Pacific region. And this organization, because it's starting to have regular meetings and more of a centralized sort of structure, is coming to the fore, and it's something to be tracked. So I'm done with remarks, and we can open it up for questions.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you, William, for providing a very comprehensive snapshot of the State of the Union for both countries in a short period of time. So in real time, I'm going to start with William about the question about China, and then go to Roman about India, about your presentation. Now, William, you have painted a rather bleak picture about China. We understand there are a lot of headwinds China is facing. So perhaps we can summarize in 3 words: debt, demography, and deflation. These are the 3 huge problems that China is facing. So let me ask you this then. After your presentations, is there a way out? Now, the Chinese government just announced that they're going to issue 1 trillion RMB, the ultra-long bond, to get some of the funding to support the manufacturing. Some experts said that it's not enough. Some have said, well, it's starting. So what is your view? Is there a way out? William, over to you.
Yes, I think definitely there's a way out, and probably that's the only way, although it's still very painful. So as I told you, China has a very unusual, unbalanced economy. Their investment share is so high, so probably the opposite of India under investment. So if you, on the other side, you look at the consumption, private household consumption share of GDP, China is very low. It's about 40%, 45%. So it is not sustainable. So the only thing, China, if I'm in charge, I would say we need to do anything to try to help household to increase their disposable income, and then they will feel comfortable to spend more. So that is, I think, the only way out. But if you do that, you're going to see the GDP growth decline, because consumption is not like investment. You can throw the money, borrow the money, and see the huge GDP growth. So I would suggest Chinese government need to abolish this kind of 5% growth, from now on, because it will create a lot of distortion. So how to increase household consumption in China, I think that is the key.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Now, to follow your questions, in terms of increasing the consumption, there are many ways to do that. First, the Chinese consumers are not poor, because during the last few years, they've accumulated around $3 trillion of savings. Chinese are very conservative. They save money in the bank. They have the highest savings rates in the world. Then the question is that right now, the consumers are not willing to spend the money because they don't know what future holds. Now, then let me ask you this then. Is there any way that to really kickstart the consumption to get the engine going? Because if you can get the consumers to buy more things like electric vehicles, upgrade energy savings appliances, that will also get the factories chunking up the machines. That will actually create more jobs, right? Then let me ask you this then. Is there any way to use maybe helicopter money that in terms of giving the vouchers? That is what China did during the recent financial meltdown. They actually give the discount, the subsidies to the consumer to purchase more appliances. Would this work this time?
Yes, very good. Yeah, I think those kind of consumption voucher is a very effective short-term fix. But I'm talking about more like long-term things. Long-term things, for example, you are right. Why? Because high investment and this current account surplus in China represent they had a very unusually high savings rate. And why Chinese save a lot more than other countries? Because they are not sure about the future. They are worried about if they get sick, do they have the money to see the doctors? So, for example, I think one of the most important things in terms of dealing with education is Chinese government can try to provide much more comprehensive social security net, like healthcare. So then Chinese family feel like, wow, they don't need to worry about if there's a rainy day. So they have the income, they are willing to spend more. So something like that, I think that would be the right path for China.
Now, I will want to ask you one more question and turn to Roman. Now, from the Western kind of economic framework, you believe in demand-driven economy. So that means that you get the consumerism going, then you get the economy going. But China has been focusing on supply economy. That means to get the people to keep on producing the stuff, and hopefully they will sell. So that's why we have a problem. China has overbuilt a lot of properties. They now also produce a lot of products, including EVs. That's why the price is going low to sell worldwide. But then there are some problems. Now, this is a fundamental question. Do you think that there's only the demand-driven economy will work, the supply economy would not work from the economic standpoint? Because Chinese governments think that they should focus on supply economy, not the demand. What is your view, William?
Well, I probably because usually when we talk about the equilibrium, actually it's both demand and supply. So what happened? I'm not quite sure. We can kind of put this kind of broad push on demand versus supply. Indeed, you are right. China had a huge problem of over manufacturing capacity, and the world is gonna paying attention to that very carefully in terms of China's export in the future. But in terms of demand, as I say, investment is part of demand, consumption is part of demand, government spending is part of demand, and foreign demand is all demand. So right now, I think the key is China has been focused a lot of resources on this so-called investment demand, and which lead to this overinvestment. So right now, they should focus how to put the household consumption to some kind of a equilibrium balance level like the Western country. So I would say, and supply side is, when you deal with the investment demand side, the supply side will kind of adjust back to the equilibrium. Yeah.
Yes, to balance it out. All right. So let me turn to Roman then. Do you have agree with what William said in terms of a more balanced supply-demand economy in China that may actually would be better?
Yeah, I very much agree with everything he said. In fact, I would add some, maybe a broader historical context. When a country goes through its phase of intensive growth, and China's probably, over the 20 years between 1990 and 2010, if you look at, there were years in there where the rate of growth had never been surpassed in the history of humanity. I mean, of course, that's believing official statistics, but even looking at, on the ground evidence of that, rising cities, rising infrastructure, the transformation of China was just remarkable. And it was capital investment driven. And in a way, to achieve these kinds of rates of growth, it needs to be. But, as I tell my students in global trends, my class on these subjects, this can't go on forever. You can't stay in a phase of intensive growth forever. At some point, you're going to slow down. It's called convergence. And that's as you reach, as you come closer and closer to the world technology frontier, you have to grow at the level of at which the technology grows, which is in the US rate of growth, about 2%. And so you have to have this transition away from capital intensive into more consumption-based and more technological innovation-based growth. And it's a good thing that you do this transition. It turns you into a more mature economy. Now, for China, it seems to be happening quite early. I mean, it depends how you define early. It has achieved remarkable levels of material well-being, and it's an upper middle income country, according to the World Bank. And that's typically where trouble starts, where you enter this, what people call the middle income trap, where countries, have trouble achieving more growth and sustaining the growth that they had in the past. I completely agree with William that this obsession about having 5% growth is, it's not a reasonable expectation to have for a mature economy. None of the mature economies have 5% growth. It's the anomaly was the very high growth that they experienced before. Now, India's in a completely different stage because it's in many ways in the middle of or at the beginning of its phase of intensive growth. There you should see the opposite happen. I mean, first, they need to mobilize a lot more capital. I talked about this, both for private capital investment and also for public infrastructure. And they need to enter this phase of intensive growth. And of course, 20 years down the line, they will experience what China is experiencing. And they'll also have to slow down, but they're not there yet, and they need to go through this phase, and they seem to be determined to go there. I don't think they'll achieve, for the reasons I mentioned, the fact that it's a pluralistic democracy, that there are governance issues and everything, it can't be directed from the top down like it was in China. That I don't think they'll quite achieve the levels of growth that China achieved during that heyday period. But 7% is incredible. If the U.S. could grow at 7%, we'd be throwing parties all the time and having a great time. So,
Yeah.
it need to be 10.
Thank you. Okay, Roman, now I turn to you. I really enjoy your presentation, and also that I follow your footsteps in terms of having 3 points. So basically, that's we will like in India, China has three Ds: debt, demography, and deflation. But I also think that India may have some challenges, and your presentation paint a very balanced view. So let me highlight the three elements that I thought about it, and this could be quite challenging. I call three E's, three D's, three E's. The first one is education. The second one is employment. The third one is exports. Now, let me start with education. Now, because right now a lot of companies, they are friendshoring, they are actually shifting a little bit away from China to India. Now, China has a very established ecosystem for manufacturing. The India now to pick it up. Now, but there is a gap between the literacy between China and India and also the education level. Then let me ask you this then. This is a systemic problem. How can the government manage the transition? Now, India is different from China. India is decentralized. China is centralized planning. So in that case, that's why the speed of working, the speed of getting job done is very different. So what will you say? How can India make the transition to provide a better education system such that people can upskill to actually to leverage, to exploit the growth right now?
It's a great question, and it's the hard work of development to build the educational institutions at every level, every echelon of the educational journey. From primary schools, secondary schools, all the way to universities, and they're doing that to a remarkable extent and degree. The problem is that what we economists call the elasticity of supply in the educational sector is very low. It takes a long time to create the institutions that can supply the skills. But in past years, with my students, we visited educational institutions. We also went to the Ministry of Skilling. India has an entire ministry devoted to trying to deal with this problem, and with remarkable human capital placed in top echelons of that bureaucracy to deal with the problem. But it also has the private sector is responding. So one of the institutions we visited is NIIT University, which is a university geared toward creating skills in the realm of computer science, biochemistry, healthcare, et cetera. So things that are in very high demand in the service-based development model that India has chosen, very different from China's approach based on manufacturing. And they're doing it, but of course they're doing it at a pace that's slowing down. It's one of the bottlenecks to growth that I mentioned, education, access to capital and infrastructure, things that limit the ability of the private sector to reach higher levels of growth. So I think you're seeing it happen organically, but it's one of the big areas where I think there could be very fruitful, big push kinds of initiatives from the government, but also in partnership with the private sector. So I support a lot of young scholars in India, and they are on the Indian job market for professorships, and they always mention universities that I've never heard of because they are 5 years old, 3 years old, 2 years old. And this is the remarkable thing that happens when you reach that level of intensive growth, that you have to create the infrastructure to support that growth. I think it will happen partly organically, and yeah.
Wow, I think this is very encouraging that the education system is growing. Now, let me come back to the issues about employment, because in China is centralized planning, but India is decentralized. For example, it's well known, as you in your presentation also mentioned, that India is well known to be bureaucratic. It has the most complicated tax systems in the world. Now, it took them a long time, even to get a global, in terms of the goods and service tax. It took them to approve the countrywide tax system in 2017. Now, but then the country is very diverse. There's north and south. The north relatively is poorer and the education level is lower, and the south is more better educated and also more economic growth. But then there's a problem. There's an imbalance of supply demand of workforce. Now, you mentioned about the caste system, but in India also there's a cultural differences. and also language differences. So if there's a growth in the South, and then you can, it's not that easy to mobilize the workforce in the North to come to the South to work. So and therefore, the workforce is not interchangeable. Then how do you overcome this problem?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are all sorts of frictions to the well-functioning of labor markets. And in fact, if you look at employment statistics and the government, it's one of the things that they're obsessed with. I think in China also, by the way, but in India, you know, and by virtue of the fact that it's such a young country and has such a huge surplus pool of labor, employing all these people, you know, is a huge challenge that has profound ramifications for politics and the electoral support of the government, et cetera. And so that's, you know, some of these things are natural barriers, as you mentioned, language, geography, you know, caste, et cetera, that I would call like cultural almost. You know, they're hard to overcome. It would require, you know, probably decades to modernize the culture in such a way that these barriers can be overcome. But there are others that are more easily addressed. And one is the very profound extent to which labor markets are distorted by government regulations and the inability of companies, for example, to easily hire and fire workers, because there's always an element of risk. If you hire too many workers, it's extremely hard to fire them because of the rules of the labor, you know, the labor rules that exist in India. And so I think there are some levers that the government could pull there to reform labor markets and make them more competitive that could partly address these issues of employment. India is also, you know, another characteristic that we didn't mention. It's still over 50% of the population is employed in agriculture. So it's still a very agrarian society. And so the attempts at reforms that the government put in place or tried to pass, actually passed, but then had to withdraw to reform agricultural markets, including agricultural labor markets, you know, were quite important from that perspective. Unfortunately, for political reasons, they failed. And so that's a huge, you know, that's a huge concern. You're going to have to manage the transition of this still very large share of the working population that's employed in agriculture into other occupations. And it's going to be one of the major challenges that India faces in its modernization process.
Very good. So now I have one more comment, and then we'll turn over to some of the questions coming in from Slido. Now, the last one is really about, you said that Indian government has kind of maybe ambiguous in terms of the growth. Now, but maybe this time is different. Under Modi's administration, they are quite bold to declare that they try to grow the GDP to $5 trillion in 2027 and make India to become a developed economy by 2047. Now, to achieve that, economists estimate that they need to have grown the GDP 9% every single year. Now, suppose that everyone was going to shift all the production to India, make in India. That's what they want. But then there's still a problem. Again, there is a systemic problem. In China, they can build a high-speed train system within 10 to 20 years. In India, the transportation system is still being developed. There are a lot of infrastructure projects, which is good, but it can be slow. Right now, I think that in terms of only the 20% of the goods, they're transported through rail. And the rail is extremely slow. It's 16 miles per hour. So there is no way to actually boost the export system unless your transportation for the rail, for the port operations going very smoothly. Then even suppose the demand is there, how can you get the supply out? Now, China has a reverse problem. They have the supply, but they don't have the demand. But now India has a demand, but they may have a supply problem. How do you overcome that?
Well, that's a hard problem. It's also the hard problem of development economics, which is how to manage the structural transformation, you know, into a modern industrial and service-based economy, which India faces. I think a lot of this happens organically as part of the process of growth, but I don't think that, you know, levels of growth that China achieved with a sort of, the virtuous combination of private and public interventions that they had over the course of their high growth period is feasible to the same degree in India, partly because of the structural barriers that we discussed. But I'm not so worried about whether it's going to be 7% or 9%. or 6% or 8%. It's still very, very high intensive growth. And a lot of these problems, particularly infrastructure, will fix themselves as part of that process. So right now, last time I was in India in December with my MBA students, we saw in Mumbai the transformation of the infrastructure that they're conducting. So they're building out in the ocean, in the Indian Ocean outside Mumbai, just a few 100 meters outside of Mumbai, a gigantic highway to bypass the congestion inside the city. And it's going to make the trip from North Mumbai, where Bollywood is, and a lot of the media, et cetera, and a lot of the economic activity is, and South Mumbai, where a lot of the wealthier people live. It's going to make that a breeze. It's going to make it much faster. It's called a sea link. So you're seeing that happen as part of the development process. The problem is that it doesn't happen fast enough to allow for rates of growth of 10%. But it does seem to be happening fast enough to allow for rates of growth of 6 or 7%. So, that's something that will happen organically. Another thing, your third E, which is exports, how does India turn outward more? I don't think that India has a problem with growth or ambiguity toward growth, especially under the Modi government, but they do have an ambiguity toward globalization. And unless you allow more imports, you're not going to allow more exports. So just to take one example, in this Asia-Pacific, in this Indo-Pacific initiative that the Biden administration has launched, there's 1/4 of the initiative that has to do with trade, and India has opted out of that. So the part of the initiative that's a free trade agreement or trying to achieve freer trade, they've opted out of. And this sort of ambiguity toward international exchange is going to cost them a few points of growth, I think. Being more engaged both on the import and export front, because they're based on reciprocity. You can't get globalization on one side without having the other, as we're seeing with China also. That ambiguity is going to cost them. And as an economist who's worked a lot on trade liberalization and trying to show some of the growth benefits of trade liberalization, despite the populist upsurge and the sort of skepticism that people have toward globalization right now, I feel like a lonely voice, but I would recommend, if I were a policy advisor, I would recommend being more comfortable with being outward oriented, because it's a big source of growth. And if India can seize this opportunity to sort of replace a little bit the role that was previously played by China, it could be a huge opportunity for them for growth.
I fully agree in terms of that's what this event is about, to facilitate global discussions. But I think sometimes politics got in the way, things got complicated. All right, so thank you so much for both of you. Now I'm going to turn over to the questions coming in from Slido. The question is that where does India sit in terms of residential real estate investments? Would they actually become more like a speculative markets like China, and then will actually maybe face the collapse down the road? Is there speculation going on in China, in India right now for real estates?
So you want me? I think this would be addressed to me.
Yes, Roman, you start first.
I think that it's very hard to know when a bubble is rising before it bursts. So I have no doubt that India at one point will be in a situation where they will overinvest in residential investment. I don't see that as a huge current problem because they have such a long way to go in creating enough dwellings for their population, particularly in suburban areas, in areas around the large cities where most of the workers will locate, ultimately when they join the organized modern economy. You're seeing that, with your own bare eyes when you travel from the airport in any big city in India to the center, huge high rises, extremely dense housing developments that go up to accommodate this rising middle class that's increasingly coming into the formal economy. And so since India hasn't really gone through that intensive phase of growth, I think that it's completely justified by the fundamentals. Now, that doesn't mean you won't see one developer here or there, have trouble. And it certainly doesn't mean that you won't see that down the road because of the momentum of a country in the high phase of growth, that ultimately, they end up overinvesting and overbuilding like China did. And when they start to slow down, they can't fill these buildings anymore, and they can't sell these cities anymore. They can't fill them with people, and and it ultimately comes to a halt.
That's a good point. Now, I want to ask William, because you talk about the real estates, the bubble burst in China. If you go back in time, China wanted to stimulate economic growth. That's why they make it easier for developers to develop more properties, easy money, easy loans. Now, in hindsight, would there be more regulations could have been actually can control this kind of bubble actually would be safer if they go back in time? Would that be a better measures? William, what do you think?
Yes, of course. So I think let me add to this. So China is gigantic country, and their model, although we say is a central control kind of economy, but they have so many population across different region in the country. So I think they adopt this a very smart way to let each province to compete with each other. So that's a good thing, like even they are kind of central control, but there's a competition to attract foreign direct investment whatsoever. That's a good thing. But the bad part is they also, when they do this kind of a competition, they tend to try to outcompete with other region for example, the leader promotion in the future. So I think that's the reason they had this kind of a overinvestment in a huge scale. So I in the 2020 hindsight, of course, I believe the Chinese government, central government, Beijing should say, this is crazy. You cannot do that, but it's too late. Yeah.
Right. And I hope that they wish to turn back the clock to have a better control.
Mhm.
Thank you. So now let me turn to another question coming in. The question is what are your thoughts on the benefits and risk with India and China working on improving their bilateral relations? Now, because both India and China, they're part of BRICS. On one hand, they are strategic partners. On the other hand, they dispute for many centuries. But then, right now for infrastructure, China has the know-how to build high-speed train, to build the port and all this. Now, then the question is there any way for these two countries to work together so they can actually become a win-win situation? I'll start with Roman and then ask William to comment. Can they work together?
That would be the ideal scenario. It would be one in which both countries join the concert of nations and trade peacefully. There's a substantial amount of trade between India and China. I don't remember the numbers now. I just had them on my screen a bit earlier, but there are huge opportunities for the two countries to interact with each other in terms of investment, in terms of trade, etc. But I do think that there are severe clouds on the horizon. I mean, I think traditionally they have been antagonists, certainly on the strategic front, and now they're competitors in terms of attracting, the interest of Western countries that are looking for a substitute for China. So I think it'll be a long road, and it'll be one that's where there are lots of uncertainties. I don't think that the fact that they're part of BRICS, we had this debate in class as to whether BRICS was really something. I think it's much more significant that India is part of the Quad than the fact that it's part of the BRICS. The BRICS are heavily heterogeneous. They're about to bring in more countries into the BRICS. The BRICS are a little bit like the non-aligned movement. It's, all the countries that are not aligned with the US kind of try to form a loose coalition, but they have very different interests and very different alignments. And so I don't see that as emerging I don't see the BRICS as emerging as a significant force. They have a bank that they set up. They don't have a permanent secretariat even. So I do think it's much more significant from a strategic perspective that India joined the Quad than the fact that it is part of the BRICS.
Okay. William, what's your take on that? Can these two countries work together?
So you mentioned that in terms of infrastructure, I think there might be good things if they can work it out, because right now China has this manufacturing over capacity, like they are building this high-speed rail and then they don't know where to put it, steel whatsoever. And India is needing that. So let me work it out, but India need to be very careful to plan does this investment really make sense in the long term? I think it will. Otherwise, you were gonna have a lot of debt like other country, like Sri Lanka, other African country. But beyond that, I see very, very little chance for these two countries to cooperate because of this Roman talking about this geopolitical competition and also the trust. I don't see two governments had a very strong trust with each other. But infrastructure, indeed, that is the only part I think they might be able to cooperate.
Well, so that means that there are opportunities to compete in some dimensions and cooperate in other dimensions, right? If you think about this, these two countries combined the population together is close to 3 billion people. And if they really become a partners, they can conquer the world, like what they used to do many, many centuries, right? But then because of the cultural and the mistrust make it more difficult. That's why the friction comes in. That is a very good point. Let me see if another questions coming in. I think the questions for Roman. What is your opinion for the ongoing debates in India about focusing on manufacturing versus a service economy while investing in education and healthcare? So should India focus on the service because they have been doing quite well? But now Modi's administration also want to expand into manufacturing because of the de-risking from China and also friendshoring. Then the question is that should India pivot to this or just have a better focus on service? Roman, what do you think?
I'm a little bit of two minds about it. As an economist, I don't see why a country couldn't leapfrog over the industrialization phase and go straight into the service economy. We had all these debates that go back to the physiocrats in the 17th century France, where they thought only agriculture could create value and manufacturing was just transforming stuff that already existed. And they were poo-pooing manufacturing. And in the same way, we have the same kind of bias against services for some reason that, the only thing that produces concrete things, and I don't mean concrete, but I mean concrete in the sense of palpable, as manufacturing, and services are a bit ethereal, so we downplay them. So I think that's, this emphasis on manufacturing, I think it may come from some political incentives, in particular jobs. It could be, I think it is perhaps the case that you can show more concrete evidence of job creation in manufacturing. And so for politicians to tout the creation of a factory might be better than to tout the creation of some, set of bank branches that exist everywhere. But I think that's largely a fallacy. So but that being said, I do think that India will invest more in manufacturing, in part because it has such a huge, it has the ability to do it. It has a large workforce that can be employed in manufacturing, trained to work in manufacturing, and it might respond to some of the declining, relationship between the U.S. or the West more generally and China by trying to substitute for some manufacturing goods as well. I think it might be part of the rebalancing of the Indian economy from being a deficit country to a more export-oriented country if they embrace that. But I don't see it as fundamental to the Indian development model. If the outcome is India has a bunch of tech jobs and banks and insurance and services, healthcare, et cetera, why not? Education. I mean, those things create value for human beings as well.
Right, I think I agree. I think maybe India need to do both because you have the huge population. They may not be that skilled to do the service like the IT, but they can help out in manufacturing. Now, then let me ask William then as a following comment. Now, India has been focused on China has been focused on manufacturing for the last few decades, and they have been really talking about to transform into service economy. So do you think that they are there or they're planning to? Is it possible for China to pivot from the huge population into the service economy, especially now when the population is shrinking?
Yeah, of course. They have to. When we talk about service, you are talking about not just kind of financial service, but also in terms of invisible sector like tourism and restaurant, all those kind of things. Yeah, that is what usually advanced economy have. They had a much bigger share of the economy in those service sector. As I say, China needs to increase their consumption share one way or the other because investment share will decline eventually. So that is important. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Well, thank you. Well, I think in the end, listening to both of you, it seems that both countries are converging. China started the economic reform in 1978. And then India has the liberation economic reform in 1991 under Manmohan Singh. So, but I think that since then, although there are different paths, but it seems that both countries are expanding into service economy as well as the manufacturing economy. So I think hopefully that in the end, everything balance out and all the countries that are in similar footing, in that case, we can preserve world peace because everyone is, there's no country, there's no boundary. That would be a wonderful world, wouldn't it? So on this note, I want to thank both of you, Roman Wasiak, Professor, and then Dr. William Yu, for sharing your insight and wisdom about India and China. And I think that there are a lot of exciting elements and events going on in these two countries. I welcome our students and our alumni to join many of you in our global immersion programs, such that they can see the world is converging. We can all work together. So on this note, I want to thank both of you and also thank the audience for the privilege of your time. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Chris.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.